No, because I teach comics myself. Otherwise, I have to find document.
I don't. They gave me the link. Sure, some things I get it, but it's like it's for a panel. And I'm like, go get someone to talk if you get it. But I can
Actually a lot. Like books I've been teaching for years, like doing international. I actually
yeah. Well, just if I could write kind of just tell me, because then to be fair, PM gave me like the standing link, so.
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves. I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the Winnipeg launch of Mr. Block, the subversive comics and writings of Ernest Riebe, published by Between the Lines Press, a fact you may applaud. We have some excellent panelists here this evening, so I won't take up too much of your time. It was so fascinating to be able to actually spend time with this book and realize how, in some cases, unfortunately timely, the comics contained within this compendium are. But it is another testament to the incredible work done by the Graphic History Collective, who put together this book that not only is the relevance of the comics assured, but also the context as well. So wonderful work of scholarship in addition to just the pleasures innately involved in it. Now, when it comes to the actual format for this evening, there'll be a series of presentations here from the podium, and then we'll move along to a Q&A session, because we do have 4 panelists here this evening. If you do have a question, we ask that you just put your hand up, and then a panelist will repeat it into the microphone for the benefit of those watching at home. If you are one of those people watching at home, and you do happen to have a question or a comment, please just feel free to write it in the chat that's active for the YouTube stream, and we'll be sure to put the questions and the comments to the panelists as time permits. If you do have any just encouraging statements you might like to pass along, rest assured I will send those to all the panelists at the close of the event. Now, you will be hearing more about the context of both Mr. Block and Ernest Riebe from tonight's panelists. I won't belabor that aspect too much this evening. Instead, I'll just introduce tonight's participants. So the Graphic History Collective itself is a group of activists, artists, and researchers who combine art and history to promote education and social justice. Starting on my left, Sean Carleton is a founding member of the Graphic History Collective and an assistant professor in the Departments of History and Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. Beside him is Julia Smith, who is also a member of the Graphic History Collective and an assistant professor in the Labor Studies program at the University of Manitoba. Patrick McGuire is a public school teacher and member of the Winnipeg General Membership Branch of the Industrial Workers of the World. And finally, Candida Rifkind is a professor in the Department of English at the University of Winnipeg, where she researches and teaches comics and Canadian literature. Here to start this evening, please join me in welcoming Sean Carleton.
Okay, thanks so much, John, and for all of you folks for coming out on a beautiful summer evening, and to Candida and Patrick for joining us to launch Mr. Block here in Winnipeg. So Julie and I are excited to be here with you to celebrate this new collection of comics and writings by Ernest Riebe, as one of our German friends helped us with the pronunciation of his name here. Here is the book that we produced with fellow historians Paul Buell and Ian McIntyre, and published by Between the Lines Press in Toronto. So we're really looking forward to having a conversation with Candida and Patrick, who have varying levels of expertise, and we're really excited to be in conversation with them this evening. And I think John perfectly timed this event, seeing as we just celebrated Labor Day, so this seems particularly relevant. So Julie and I are going to kick things off by telling you a little bit more about Riebe and Mr. Block, and the comics and writings that are included in this collection. Then we're going to pass things over to Patrick, who will talk about the connection between art and labor organizing and why Mr. Block remains relevant for today. And then Candida is going to talk about how the Mr. Block comics fit into the early 20th century American comics history landscape. And after that, we're going to have a conversation between the four of us and then open it up to questions from you folks. Okay, well, let's get things started. Why not kick this celebration of art and labor with some art and labor? I'm going to play a little bit of a song. I heard Taylor Swift on the music over there, so I'll try to compete with. Please give me your attention, and I'll introduce to you a man who is credited to our red, white, and blue. His head is made of lumber, it's solid as a rock. He's a common worker, and his name is Mr. Block. Block thinks he may be president someday. Mr. Block, you will come outside. Take a cake, make me ache, tie a rock around your block, and then jump in a lake. Can we do that for liberty's sake? I'm speaking in front of hundreds of people every weekend, yet playing a couple of bars. It's the most nerve-wracking. So begins Joe Hill's song about the misbeliefs and misadventures of Mr. Block, a fictional character representing the typical anti-union blockhead. As the song's lyrics go on to explain, we might peer pressure Patrick to share some more. Mr. Block has no time for labor agitation. He scorns radical and revolutionary unions such as the IWW or the Wobblies, to which Hill belonged. Instead, he wrongly believes that loyalty to the boss, rather than organizing on the job with his fellow workers, will get him all the good things in life. In the song's chorus, Hill vents his frustrations with this kind of thick-headedness amongst some members of the working class, which Mr. Block as a character symbolizes. Hill's humorous song, first published in 1913, has become an IWW standard. Alongside such famous tunes as There's Power in the Union and Solidarity Forever, which you might be more familiar with, Mr. Block has been sung by Wobblies and fellow travelers for well over a century. The song also looms large in Wobbly lore. When Hill was arrested in Salt Lake City in 1914, before eventually being executed by the state of Utah, an IWW newspaper described him as the man who wrote Mr. Block. Since then, other IWW writers have attributed the creation of Mr. Block to the famous Wobbly troubadour, but that's not entirely correct. Though Hill helped popularize the square-headed character within the Union, he didn't create Mr. Block. The song is actually a tribute to a character invented by one of Hill's contemporaries, artist Ernest Riebe. Indeed, 2 months before Hill's song was published, Mr. Block made his illustrated debut, drawn by Riebe in November 1912 in the pages of the IWW's newspaper, The Industrial Worker. Now, much has been written about IWW artists and organizers like Hill, but there is a lack of writing about other figures, such as Riebe, who also made important contributions in the early 1900s to the IWW's rich archive of agitational art. 100 years later, this new anthology offers a collection of Riebe's subversive Mr. Block comics and writings to highlight their historical significance and ongoing relevance. So first things first, what do we know about the person who created Mr. Block? What do we know about Riebe? Unfortunately, the answer is very little. The information that is available is mostly speculative, pieced together from fragments left behind. This lack of personal information is common for many Wobbly artists and organizers from the early 1900s. What we do know is that Riebe is believed to have been born in Dresden, Germany, possibly in the 1880s or 1890s, before immigrating to the United States. Historian Douglas M. Haller, one of the few scholars who's actually written about Riebe, surmises that he was likely an itinerant laborer and that he may have been based out of Minneapolis or somewhere in Washington state. Nevertheless, though few personal details about Riebe have been uncovered, we know that he was gifted with sharp wit and considerable artistic skill. In just over a decade, Riebe produced a treasure trove of agitational art, but his most famous works were undoubtedly the comics and writings about Mr. Block. So Mr. Block made his debut on the back page of the Industrial Worker on November 7th, 1912. And I'll pass this along so you can have a look. It's on page 3. So you can, as they make their way around, you can see Mr. Block's debut on page 3 of that book. And his first appearance was just one panel. Most of the other comic strips are 6 to 8 panels. This is just a one-panel teaser. And it's called Mr. Block, He Shows His Superiority. The image features a well-dressed man with characteristically square head, wearing a top hat and a fancy suit, carrying a walking stick and smoking a cigarette, very dignified. Accompanying the image are Mr. Block's first words. What, me? Join the IWW? Nothing but working men belong to it. I am a clerk. I expect a raise pretty soon, and then my salary will be $12 per week. So in this comic, as an introduction to the character of Mr. Block, Riebe is deliberately poking fun at the kind of worker who thinks he is superior to other members of the working class and thus above joining the union. Rather than acknowledge his class position and organize with his fellow workers to improve his lot in life, Mr. Block chooses to believe that he is just a temporarily embarrassed millionaire. So Riebe's point is really clear. Mr. Block is a blockhead. His naivety and narrow-mindedness are impediments to working class solidarity and victory. The hope was that laughing at Mr. Block and ridiculing what is talked about in the union as blockism would foster critical consciousness amongst the newspaper's working class readers. So throughout 1912 and 1913, Riebe published more Mr. Block comics, usually on the final page of the newspaper. Now, the comics covered a variety of topics from Mr. Block condemning union organizing and the use of sabotage or direct action, to his misbelief in electoralism, racist ideas pushed by the bosses to divide workers, among many others. Each strip shares a similar style and narrative arc. Mr. Riebe introduces a common misbelief held by conservative workers and then uses Mr. Block and his follies as a vehicle to encourage readers to confront and debunk it. The strips are thus revolutionary education in illustrated form. In just 6 or 8 illustrated panels, Riebe distills the agitation and education of a fiery soapbox speech, a punchy silent agitator, stickers that the Wobblies would put around as a form of propaganda, or a powerful pamphlet. So I'm going to hand things over to Julia now, who will tell you a little bit more about Riebe's Mr. Block comics specifically.
Everyone hear me okay? Awesome. Okay. I was telling people here before last night, we were at the Massey lecture at Prairie Theater Exchange, and every time someone would ask a question, there was some person in the back who was like, "We can't hear you. Speak into the microphone." Yeah, Peter, you were there, you know. So I don't want to do that. I have her voice in my head. Yeah, so thanks, Sean. And thanks again to John for supporting this event, organizing it, really doing all the work. We just showed up. So thanks, John. And thanks to all of you for being here. So as Sean explained, Riebe often portrays Mr. Block as well-meaning but hopeless. Mr. Block's humorous misadventures are meant to be a warning to the working class. Don't be a blockhead, organize. Historian Douglas Haller argues that in the 1910s, most other Wadley cartoonists were focused on forces external to the workers as being responsible for the enslavement of the working class. So things like capitalists, the government, Christianity, these were the favorite targets in our IWW cartoons. In the Mr. Block series, however, though, if you're picking through there, you can see it's the working person himself who must wear the bulk of the responsibility for his enslavement. Riebe's creation was effective because Mr. Block highlighted the role of self-emancipation and the necessity of ridding sections of the working class of blockism. In this way, the comic strip became an important consciousness-raising tool within the IWW. Indeed, Riebe's Mr. Block comics were such a success that in 1913, the editor of The Industrial Worker, Walker C. Smith, decided to collect, print, and sell them together as a standalone pamphlet. So though Riebe created and developed Mr. Block in the pages of The Industrial Worker and in the 1913 pamphlet, his work by Mr. Block was not limited to these publications. He actually produced a number of other Mr. Block works in various IWW newspapers, but these works have received less attention than his earlier ones. And we don't have too much time, so I won't go into details, but in the question period, we can talk about it. This was where the collaboration became really key. One of our co-editors, Ian McIntyre, who's based in Australia, he was doing work on this as well there, and actually had found a number of comics that, as far as we can tell, people in North America hadn't seen before. So they've obviously probably started here, but have been lost over time. So we can chat more about that if people are interested. So of particular note here is a full page spread that's titled When Block Meets Block, and it outlines Riebe's perspective on World War I. So if you have a copy of the book in front of you, you can take a look. It's on page 52, 53. Hard to miss because it's a big double page spread. So though Riebe is believed to be of German origin, his loyalty was to the international working class. And the comic explains this view by showing Mr. Blocks on both sides of the war, fighting each other to death on the battlefield. So if you're looking at it, you can see everyone, all the blockheads there. And then if you look in the top right-hand corner, you'll see a group of buzzards identified as the International Plunder Fund, representing the capitalist profiteers getting rich from the war. And you can see they're watching over the blocks fighting one another. So this kind of critical analysis suggested that one half of the world's working class was fighting the other half, while imperialists and industrialists benefited. And it was in keeping with what some Wadleys thought about World War I. Riebe had previously used his comics to lampoon unthinking, flag-waving patriots. Again, if you flip through the book, you'll see other ones that take up these themes. When Block Meets Block shows that he continued to develop this critique during the war, despite the danger of harboring such views. Indeed, many Wadleys faced persecution and even death for their pro-union and anti-war positions at the time. As well, the United States government used the IWW's perceived lack of patriotism and loyalty as a pretense to outlaw and attack the Union. Riebe continued to make Mr. Block comic strips in 1914, but after that, the trail goes cold until the end of the war. In 1919, he resurfaced and revived Mr. Block for a number of IWW newspapers. He also published a pamphlet called Mr. Block and the Profiteers, which we've included in part 1 of the anthology. At the time, up to today, the pamphlet has received little attention, yet it's arguably Riebe's most detailed exploration of the Mr. Block character. It explains Block's history, his characteristics, and his penchant for backing the bosses, profiteers, and parasites of the world over his fellow workers. So Riebe was busy. In addition to publishing a few comic strips in the early 1920s, he also wrote 2 short essays that feature Mr. Block. One is called A Job, and the other is called Political Bunk. And he also wrote a play. So we've included all of these things in the anthology. After the mid-1920s, however, Riebe, like many working class artists of the time, fades from the historical record. And unfortunately, few details are known about his later life. Nevertheless, Mr. Block has gone on to fame, with many Wadleys still referencing the recognizable character as a shorthand to critique blockism and all who pander to bosses instead of organizing with their fellow workers. This staying power is due in part to IWW activists and historians who have chosen to focus on Riebe and Mr. Block's importance in their own works. This aspect of the Mr. Block story is showcased in part 2 of the anthology. So part 1 focuses on Riebe's work, and part 2 is things that have been inspired by his work. So these responses to Mr. Block comics demonstrate the importance of Riebe's work in his time as well as its lasting legacy. Joe Hill's well-known song about Mr. Block and Walker C. Smith's introduction to the 1913 pamphlet show that Riebe's contemporaries viewed his creation as a powerful organizing tool at that time. Several decades later, IWW artist Carlos Cortez mused, "It is hoped that some of these archivists who are in possession of Riebe's old books will see fit to republish them, not only as historical or nostalgic documents, but as works of popular art that can draw a parallel between today's working conditions and those of several generations ago." IWW historian Franklin Rosemont answered Cortez's call and helped to produce a 1984 reprint of the 1913 Mr. Block pamphlet with Charles H. Kerr. And we've got a copy here, so sorry folks at home, or sorry folks online, you don't get to look at this. I'll pass this around to everyone who's here. So this reprint brought the lessons of Mr. Block to a new generation. As well, wobbly artists have often revived and revised Mr. Block, and we've included one example by Nick Thorkelson, which comes from another anthology about the wobblies called Wobblies. And again, don't have time to get into it, but in researching this and Googling Mr. Block, apparently there's also a whole Bitcoin thing with Mr. Block themed. I have no idea. I think they have totally missed the point, but I encourage you to look it up. It's so bizarre, and I keep trying to find a way to work it into our spiel, but other than just telling you it exists, I don't know yet. It's wild. Very in keeping with Bitcoin, from what I understand of it. Okay, so Mr. Block, Riebe, of course, is no longer alive to draw Mr. Block, but the character and Riebe's critique live on in the work of others. And this is a good thing, we argue, because although Mr. Block is over 100 years old, he's not ready for retirement. The lessons from his misbeliefs and misadventures are as relevant as ever. The fight against blockism continues. Many working people still believe they will be rewarded for their loyalty to bosses and faith in the capitalist system. In reality, however, they usually get more exploitation and hardship. Capitalists profit from our labor, but they also benefit from our ignorance and inability to organize together. Building the new world in the ashes of the old requires many tools: education, agitation, and collective action, but also laughter and lampooning the blockheads among us. The latter can help us clarify our own role and responsibility in the emancipation of our class and the abolition of the wage system. And we hope that this new anthology can help that work along. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much to Julia and Sean for inviting me out to speak today. I don't really know if I have too much to add because you've both done a very exceptional job of saying what needs to be said about these comics. But I will say my interest in them is as a member of the industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies. And when I think about the comics and their role as an organizational or a tactic for getting people involved and thinking about the union, it makes me think about the IWW logo, which is in small on my chest. I wish there was actually one in the book to point you to, but I don't think there is actually a globe in the logo. But it's a circular logo with an IWW and 3 stars and then a little globe underneath it. And each one of those 3 stars represents education, organization, and emancipation. And that was kind of the IWW's idea or model, the way that wanted to make unionism happen and their model for organizing and trying to change society. So the IWW, of course, was a revolutionary industrial union formed in 1905 in Chicago. It was formed as a reaction against the conservative trade and craft unionism that was common in North America at the time. It was internationalist. It was favoring a model of direct action in workplace. So rather than trying to go for long contracts, but workers directly settling and taking action in the workplaces, particularly through strike action, but other types of methods of action. And so the stars on the globe basically talk about education, organization, and emancipation. And they're in that order on purpose. But I think before you can go to organization, which is the form of direct action, workers coming together and forming some sort of new structure that was going to directly challenge their employers and then eventually emancipate the working class. And that is by like overthrowing capitalism, trying to create some sort of new society, which the IWW historically called industrial democracy, or sometimes the cooperative commonwealth of toil, what I would today call workers' self-management. But before you had to do those things, you had the education. And Sean mentioned this, but just that the IWW had many, many ways in which they were engaged in this project of working class education. So trying to raise people's consciousness and understanding themselves as workers in a capitalist society. And so those included songs, right? So the classic songs of Joe Hill and other songwriters who took hymns of the time that were very popular and then rewrote the lyrics to be working class songs. Silent agitators, which were stickers that were put up in hobo jungles and workplaces and other places where the working class people gathered. A lively working class press, right? So like actual weekly and monthly newspapers in multiple languages. And then comics and art, like Mr. Block. And so the idea of that is, again, is to demystify and challenge all those ideas, right? So, you know, ruling ideas of every epoch, or the ideas of the ruling class. So this idea of individualism, of you know, focus on you know, accumulation for yourself, the idea that if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you can become the CEO someday, or you can become the, you know, the prime minister or the president or whatever, and then you'll have power over others. And again, I teach students at a high school level, and so, you know, those kind of ideas of like, you know, rugged individualism are still with us, right? And like young guys tell me in class that they want to drive a Bugatti someday because that's the thing that they've been told is like valuable and important or whatever. Or they idolize, you know, Elon Musk, or like see like pictures of Andrew Tate being like graffitied on walls and stuff, or like handed out in schools. Like these ideas of like competitive individualism and power over are like still around us, and they're not, they're still as relevant today as they were 100 years ago. So this idea of like education and trying to change people's ideas is through this idea of like mocking these kind of reactionary ideas about nationalism, about xenophobia, about ethnocentrism that blockheads had back then and blockheads still have today. So that's what I want to say about when I think about the Globe and education, you know, organization and emancipation, that Riebe's comics are really part of that education that the IWW was so committed to, as far as raising people's consciousness. And the other thing that I'll just say quickly is just I'm also fascinated by Riebe as kind of like an organic intellectual. So there's been a lot of focus in the IWW historiography about like the most famous, you know, leaders and so on. So Big Bill Haywood and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and Joe Hill. But I think that it's really interesting to really focus on the artwork of someone who is relatively unknown. I mean, the comic was quite popular in the time and it's been celebrated in many ways, but very few people know who Ernest Riebe is today. And I think it's really neat to think about someone who had a specific skill set, which is being a decent artist with a sharp wit, who we don't know where he worked. He never led any heroic or historic strikes, right? We're not even sure what city he lived in, but he had this specific skill set that he thought was useful, that he deployed for the use of the working class to raise consciousness and give back, right? So we always use this phrase in the IWW about helping the work along. So it's not about being some sort of heroic leader, but the idea that like we all have skills to contribute. And I find this idea of Riebe as an organic intellectual who did this thing through a comic for a number of years to be really inspiring to all of us, both thinking about like how does social change happen in a movement? Well, it happens from all of us doing things in a movement with our skill set. So I think that's what I'm going to say. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, John. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Candida and I teach comics. And as I'm about to talk, I realize this might be a bit like academic. I'm trying not to be, but a cartoonist in Winnipeg was walking past our house when I was gardening and he heard me talking to a neighbor and he said, "That voice sounds like lectures." And I thought, oh God, do I only know how to speak and lecture? That was great. Can you check who said that? Thanks so much to Sean and Julia for inviting me and for all the work you do with the Graphic History Collective. as someone who researches and teaches comics, your work is so important in filling gaps in historical comics and reprints, and also commissioning new work. And you know, it's really valuable, and I hope you will continue to produce this valuable work. And thanks so much, Patrick, for filling that in, because I learned a lot from your talk. And I hope I won't repeat it, because I'm going to take a slightly different lens, which is when I read Mr. Block, I hear the things that you're all saying about the IWW. I see them, but I also think so much about what comics were like over 100 years ago, because there are ways in which Riebe was very unique. I mean, the subversive energy of his Mr. Block comics is unique for the period and maybe for today. But he's also very much doing what other cartoonists were doing, and he's taking what was at that time a fundamentally profit-making capitalist newspaper form and appropriating it for his movement and his cause, showing us that comics are always political and that they are a flexible form, right? They're just like a container you can pour different messages into. So for a long time, these early American comics have been dismissed as being, you know, too like of the moment, too ephemeral, too insignificant. But I think he shows us how comics are just a medium, like film or poetry or prose, and different movements can grab onto them. So I think Sean already mentioned that these are pre-Golden Age comics. So in American comics history, the Golden Age is what you think of as classic comics, Superman, then later on Spider-Man as well. So the 1930s to 50s, the comic books that sort of really launched mass market comics in the US and then globally. But in this early period, from about the 1890s to 1930, and just sidebar, comics emerge around the same time as film. So we can think about the two early forms as two ways in which artists were thinking about how putting images one after the other sequentially could do new kinds of storytelling. So the early newspaper comics, what we call the funnies, or used to call the funnies, are really the first modern comics as we know them. And Mr. Block really fits within that format. So the earliest comics came about when two newspaper barons, whose names you'll probably recognize, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, were running competing New York daily newspapers. And in order to increase their subscription and newsagent sales, they needed to pull in working class and immigrant readers whose English might not be up to reading full articles. So they started to publish comics. And 4-color comics printing came in at that time. So it was a powerful and fun thing to have within a newspaper, and it sold more papers. So the roots of comics as we know them, at least in the American form, come out of that kind of capitalist competition for readers at the beginning of the 20th century. And yet so many labor, socialist, communist, and other radical cartoonists have seized onto the form. So the other interesting thing I was thinking about is, you know, back when I was doing my PhD dissertation, I combed through a lot of 1930s leftist periodicals. I didn't see a single comic strip. I saw editorial cartoons. So the single panel, satirical or critical comics. It's quite unusual to have a sustained serial comic strip in the radical press. And I think that's a testament to Riebe and to the IWW for recognizing the force of a comic strip like this. But I have a few things I'm going to say very quickly. And one thing that I think is really interesting for comics scholars and historians is that Riebe fits within a growing understanding that the history of American comics is German. So Riebe was probably born, he said, between the 1880s and 1890s, and then immigrated to the US. Most of the early, really popular and important newspaper funnies were by German-American artists. And there's all kinds of interesting reasons that my colleagues in German studies are working on, you know, for why this was the case. But part of it is because there was already a strong visual culture in Germany, in pop culture, of illustrated stories. So looking at Riebe's potential birth date, he would definitely have grown up in Germany reading the Max and Moritz books, which were illustrated satirical comic, well, not comics, they were like a page and then a verse and illustrations and so on. And they're considered one of the forerunners of comics. They really influenced a German-American cartoonist called Rudolf Dirks, who developed a strip called The Katzenjammer Kids, which lasted until 2006, unbelievably. But when Dirk was working on it, he was a German immigrant to the US, and he started that in 1897. And there's interesting things about The Katzenjammer Kids. He continued other early comics use of speech balloons, which were fairly new, rather than having text below the illustration, sequential panels, not just one editorial cartoon, easily identifiable character types who don't change. Every comic strip, they're the same and they do the same thing, and the joke is in their familiarity and their predictability. And the Katzenjammer kids were working class immigrants, and they speak English with a German accent, as it's written, and they're mischievous boys who are always kind of trying to trick authority figures and playing jokes on adults. So a lot of the early American comics around Mr. Block had children or talking animals as their protagonists. Mr. Block is also interesting because although he's a blockhead and quite childlike, and a clown in some ways, he's not a child. So there's something interesting going on there with what the IWW is doing to reach their audience, to see themselves reflected in an adult figure. Another German-American artist was Lionel Feininger, who was from Chicago, which in 1906 was apparently about a quarter German, so it makes sense that there was this really important German-American cultural influence. And he did the Kinder Kids, which is quite an experimental comic, and he went on to become affiliated with the Bauhaus and Cubism and quite a highbrow artist. So Mr. Block, I think, can be read as part of this way in which early American comics are quite German, and the way that they kind of develop this sideways look at American culture and patriotism and the American dream. So even the ones that aren't as leftist or radical or subversive as Mr. Block are always kind of showing characters who are bumbling and failing to meet the American dream. Early American comics are also very working class, very urban. They're often set in the New York tenements. And they really reflect the social shifts of modernity. So the turn of the 20th century, immigration, urbanization, industrialization, consumerism, poverty, and so on. So I could talk more about early immigrant comics, but I think it's a really interesting way to think about American comics as coming out of those massive waves of immigrants to New York City in the early 20th century. The other interesting thing for me reading Mr. Block is if you have the book, you'll notice the early panels. When the 1912 panels that were, or strips that from the Industrial Worker have numbers in them. So there's hand lettered numbers in the bottom of each panel. Those disappear after a few strips, and then they come back when he shifts publication to the One Big Union Monthly. Now, quite a few early cartoonists did this, and what this tells us is they didn't think their audience knew how to read comics yet. So we know now that in the West, you just kind of instinctively know that you read comics left to right, top to bottom in a Z pattern. And of course, with manga and Asian comics, you read in reverse. But audiences and readers at this time didn't know how to read comics. So the comic strip had to teach its readers its own form. And he clearly thought they'd got it after a few, so he stopped numbering them. But then he just publications. And who would, a new audience, we have to teach them again. So I think that's really interesting. The other thing that's interesting for me that I mentioned is the repetition with a different structure. So it's the same kind of gag. We talk about gag comics in this period. It's the same kind of joke every time. The joke is on Mr. Block because he has this brilliant idea to do something that will, defy the idiots of the IWW and, support capitalism, and he'll make his money, but then the bank fails after he invests in it, or something else calamitous happens. And he just acts in the same way again and again. So there's this kind of message of repetition, but also the joke becomes familiar yet enjoyable and pleasurable because we want to see what's going to happen to him. We know what's going to happen. The other comparison I want to make, if you're interested in this period, is to Henry Kiyama's The Four Immigrants manga. Kiyama based these on his own experiences as a Japanese migrant worker in San Francisco between 1904 and I think about 1924. They were printed in a Japanese-American paper in Japanese, but later translated. And they look very similar. They have four Japanese students, young men, who are brought over as so-called houseboys. And it's all about the sort of escapades they get into because their English isn't good and they don't understand what the upper class woman of the house wants them to do when she says clean the stove. But it also folds in actual experiences like earthquakes in San Francisco and then the influenza epidemic. So there's a way in which there's this whole culture of immigrant comics with specific targeted audiences, some in immigrant languages, some not, some for specific movement audiences, some not. And they're all reflecting people's lives back to them and bringing humor and satire to it as well, because they're funny. Like at some level, they're just really funny comics. So one last example I'll mention is closer to home, and there's talk of an exhibit of these comics coming up next year, but it's the Ukrainian immigrant Jacob Maidanek, who was also an early cartoonist doing Ukrainian language satirical strips about life in Winnipeg. They were the Uncle Tabachnik comics starting around 1915 in Ukrainian farmers magazines. And he was religious, he was really high up. They ran like the church store for the Ukrainian church, but they are also depicting everyday life with some satire and kind of showing immigrant experiences and working class experiences in North End Winnipeg. There's a National Film Award film about him if you want to learn more. So my 3 points, just to wrap up, Mr. Block is part of a rich early North American comics culture that was profoundly international thanks to its many immigrant artists who brought both their own visual traditions and a sideways view on mainstream American culture, predominantly white North American culture. This somewhat riotous newspaper comics culture of the early 1900s was deeply satirical, and it inherited this mode from the editorial cartoon tradition, which goes back at least 200 years before that. Although Riebe obviously has a very different target of his satire. And humor is used to help readers understand their own experiences of the major shifts of modern life. And finally, although these examples I've mentioned are very different and diverse, I think all these early American satirical funnies show how comics are always political. So it's a political form in itself because it's trying to reach a wider audience. It's trying to use humor to educate and emancipate. And the republication of Mr. Block helps to fill in one of the gaps in our history by showing us how an IWW cartoonist really knew mainstream comics well. And you see actually some homages to cartoonists of the time in the book that you have. But it reminds us that popular culture was as much in the hands of radical and subversive artists as it was in those of the capitalist press. Thanks.
Okay, thanks to Patrick in Canada. We're just going to, with John's assistance, move this mic over. We're going to have a couple of questions amongst the panelists, and then we'll open things up for you folks. Ready? Okay.
I should really have interstitial music for this.
Put back the Taylor Swift.
Save some more Mr. Block. Patrick and Sean, I'm just saying.
I have to jump in and say, can I just jump in and say one thing?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So, Canada, when you're talking about the numbering of the frames, I've taught Canadian history numerous times, and one of the resources I always use is Chester Brown's Louis Riel graphic history. And the first couple times I used that with my students, I had to teach them how to read comics. I know that like those who read comics read manga, right? And so to read left to right, and then you understand that this is on a different page and you have to jump over, it's fascinating to me that it's not as common anymore as you think it would be.
Yeah, I mean, to Patrick's point about education, right? Riebe had to educate people how to understand this new medium that people may not have encountered before. And I think the IWW editor at the time, Walker C. Smith, really thought that, to Canada's point, that these comics would excite people and help sell newspapers. So it was, yes, about spreading the IWW's message, but it was also figuring out how do you do that, right? At the time in the early 1900s, as Patrick mentioned, the Wobblies would take popular songs, rewrite the lyrics, play them in public as a way of competing on street corners for attention, to get people to pay attention to the Union. So I think Canada and Patrick's comments, I think, align with what we were trying to do with the book, to help people understand Mr. Block as something more than a simplistic strip, and really understanding the layers that Riebe was bringing. I mean, he's clearly very talented for someone who never got paid, apparently, for any of his work. He would work during the day and he would make his comics at night and send them off to get printed. And I think that's a testament to his skill, and I think obviously worth remembering today. We were just going to have a couple of questions and discussion, and so I wondered, perhaps Julia, if I could ask you a question, simply because you mentioned something we didn't have a lot of time to talk about, which is the process of bringing all of these different pieces together. If you wanted to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. So, and I think I said this, one of our co-editors, Ian, he said he might join us online. So John, if he makes a comment in the chat, please do let us know. But he could also be working his daytime in Australia. Yeah, I mean, a lot of work, we again didn't get into it, but working collaboratively, like we actually haven't met Ian in person. Our other co-editor, Paul Buell, we've met once before, but we worked with Paul a number of times. So I was thinking a lot of that when Patrick, you were talking about kind of the wobbly model too, of like helping the work along and everyone's sharing their skills. That's really kind of at the heart of what we do in the Graphic History Collective. And this project is reflective of that in terms of partnering with folks, you know, everyone giving their skills and their resources that they were working with. You know, Ian could have easily just said, like, I'm publishing my own book over here in Australia, like, and seen us as competition, but instead it was just this really wonderful partnership and working together to produce something bigger than we could have done on our own, either here in Canada, Paul in the US, or Ian in Australia. Also on production, I guess, is that it won't surprise those of you who are historians or who worked with old documents. Many of these comics were in really, really bad shape. And if you're interested in hearing more about that process, we're doing an online talk in a couple of weeks with the Toronto Workers' History Project, and Devin Clancy, who's the designer that worked with us in BTL to restore a lot of these comics. We'll be talking about that aspect, because you know, oftentimes people say, like, oh, are you artists? I mean, you're a bit of an artist, Sean, but I am not an artist at all. And I'm not a graphic designer. And for example, like the When Block Meets Block one, that beautiful 2-page spread, if we could show you, we would, the before and after. And Devin worked tirelessly to restore that image and make it look the way it does. And I think there is one in there, I'm not sure the page number. We left one that was in rough shape just to kind of illustrate. I think it's near the end of part 1. Sean might find the page number. And for sure, there's ones that are missing and that we just haven't been able to find. Again, you heard me mention the IWW being banned and persecuted. Many of their offices were destroyed, and so a lot of their records, and Patrick could probably say more about this, from that time period especially, are gone. So yeah, a lot of work went into touching up. Do you have the page number? Yes, so it's on page 59. If you look, you can kind of see one that's ripped at the bottom. So yeah, a lot of collaboration, partnership, and also technological wizardry to restore these.
Yeah, and just quickly, the pamphlet that we handed out there has 24 comics, and I think a lot of people had thought that that was the extent of Riebe's run. But in reality, it was just the first 24 comics that he published in the Industrial Worker, and then that got reprinted in the 80s. So it was thanks to Paul and Ian and our work looking at archives around the world to really piece together Riebe's full arsenal of agitational comics. There are over 70. There's a pamphlet, there's a play. So he really put a lot of effort into developing Mr. Blockhead as a character that I think deserves wider recognition than just these. The 24 comics are quite good. But the full 70, I think 6 or 8, really showcase the breadth that Riebe was bringing to his craft.
And here, I'll take a plug. If anyone here is an actor who wants to possibly take on doing the play for Fringe, yeah, think about it. Patrick, Sean, no, yes, because it's very funny.
Ian just
oh, Ian's there. Okay,
said he's there and he's enjoying the conversation. I think
awesome.
it's early morning in Australia, but just thanks Ian. Just keeping an eye on our time. We wanted to also offer some space to you folks for coming out, and if you wanted to ask questions,
or Patrick in Canada, if you want to say anything else right now, or
I'm good. If anyone wants to ask us, please do.
Questions, yeah.
Candida, I really enjoyed how you're saying that this is also, we have to think of this in the context of other comics that were in the papers. And I immediately, when I was looking at this, I thought of the husband and wife relationship, especially, I was just looking at on page 33, you have Mrs. Block throwing a rolling pin at, and that immediately I thought of Maggie and Jigs and Bringing Up Father, which is also a comic from this. So I think there's also the way that people can sort of see themselves in this marriage too, in the negotiation, because the wife's often super critical or even physically abusive of the husband. But that was also in other comics. So would anybody like to just talk about the sort of domestic life that's being depicted in this comic?
For sure, yeah. I just have to repeat the question a little bit for our viewers online. So the question was thinking about Mr. Block's relationship to Mrs. Block, and the ways in which gender and that kind of relationship, that everydayness, was reflected in the comics.
I'm gonna defer some of this to people who know the strips much better to talk specifically about Mrs. Block. But I will say that what you're talking about, this kind of slapstick violence between married couples is really common in the comic, and violence towards kids, which I think today my students are often shocked by the physical violence of manga, which is, it's all part of the rhetoric and the style of the form, but in early American comics, there's so much physical humor. I think it's related to vaudeville, and I think it's related to a kind of culture of physical humor. But what's interesting is that domestic relationship is really subordinated to Mr. Block's public life and him being out and engaging with other people. But the domestic story is there, and there's little blockheads, right? There's a number of little kids as well. But the wife does emerge as a kind of critical voice who might be there. My reading would be to let readers know that this is satire, that the cartoonist position isn't the same as Mr. Block's, right? So you need a critical voice in there of Mr. Block's internal to the strip to let readers know what the correct way to think about this is. But maybe Julia or Sean could talk more about it specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I think I noticed Mrs. Block coming up more in the later comics, particularly after 1919. And so I'm wondering, you know, why that's the case. I wish we could ask him and find out why, you know, he's bringing that in. I think Canada, you're right in the sense that in some ways Mrs. Block is there to show you that even in that relationship, clearly Mr. Block is an idiot. You know, like you invested our life savings in this war bond that then got used to, you're like, you're not going to get it, or you know, you think you're going to get the janitor's job when in reality you're not. Like, this is so frustrating. I think there's a relatability also to that, and that more people than just Block suffer as a result of his narrow-mindedness. And so I think that it is somewhat relatable, whether that's 1919 or 2023, that kind of frustration. I'm not going to invest their savings in Bitcoin or, but you know, I think that there is that kind of relatability in the moment, but also across time for sure.
Yeah, and I was just looking on page 33 is one of my favorite ones. It's Mr. Block, he has some uplifting done. I mean, again, so many of these are relevant, but this one is basically like he's feeling sad because like he's poor and I think he's unemployed if I remember correctly, but life is hard, and some like upper class women come along and be like, all you need is like a positive attitude, and you know, like this would be Goop today, right? Because Gwyneth Paltrow. And so he comes home with this package and his wife's like, oh good, it looks like a side of bacon. And instead it's basically a health hint. You know, have some, sing, smile, rest a while and walk a mile, right? And she gets really mad. So I think Mrs. Block is often portrayed as like the practical one, right? Like she's livid, right? That's not helpful. We need meat, which is a very practical attitude. So that's the role that I see her playing. And it sounds like a little bit like what you're saying in Canada. That's kind of in some of the other comics. Maybe it's not as overtly kind of a critique of capitalism, but.
I think what's interesting is that we have a working class woman represented as efficient, practical, rational, and all of that. Quite a lot of the gendering of early comics often shows upper class or upper middle class women as the kind of figures of fun, especially in things like the Four Immigrants manga. It's these rich white women who are ridiculous compared to the lives of everyday working men. So, and you can think about it, some comparisons people make to early comics and early Chaplin films like The Tramp, and the way that it's often wealthy women who are the ones who thwart the tramp. So Chaplin's Tramp, Mr. Block, there are all these figures of sort of masculine protagonists who have relationships to women who are just typical or stereotypical. Mrs. Block is different, right? She's obviously a thoughtful, practical woman, not just a foil to our protagonist.
Bacon is much better than a new flag to wave at home. Other questions? Yep.
So thank you for all of this. I know it's early days in the book being out in the world, but I think one thing that happens when these kinds of projects go out in the world is you end up finding words in the sense that you think you've scoured all the possible kind of locations and analytics, but then once you've actually got this book that circulates, you find out more. So I guess I wish this money has that happened yet to you, and if so, what have you found out?
Sure, just to repeat the question for our online viewers, the question was, now that the book is out in the world, are there things that we wish we knew or things that we would like to know more about? I certainly have a couple of examples.
Well, I want to take Candida and Patrick's comments and put them in the book and add them.
Yeah, I was
Really
gonna say,
helpful.
yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's the thing. I'm sure everyone who's written something, right, as soon as you like put it in print, you're like, oh, then of course I find out something big. So, and again, Ian, if you're listening to this and you want to add in, if you found new things since in Australia, please do put that in the chat. Yeah, I mean, right off the bat, I know I became kind of obsessed with being like, we have to find out like where he was living. It can't be that hard. There has to be some trace. So I've got a few leads that I need to follow up on. It looks like he might have been living around Chicago for some time. If it's the same person, I need to figure out how to access archives, the US Copyright Office. It looks like if it's the same person, he filed for a copyright of, not Mr. Block, of a different piece of art that he had done. Now, I don't know, again, I don't know how common the name Riebe is, or Ernest Riebe, so Riebe, so we'll have to look into that. But so that's one. There's another person who is credited with claiming that he spends the rest of his life in China. That's where he dies. So I think it's Franklin Rosemont who mentions that and cites local historian in Minneapolis who I've been trying to track down to connect with to find out what his source is for that, right? This is why I tell students footnotes are so important because someone's going to come along and want to know where that information comes from. So far, that's about it. But our hope is that with this being out, other people might realize like, oh, I've seen that before, or because if these things are lying around, they're probably going to be in someone's newspaper collection in their basement, somewhere where it wasn't destroyed.
And I mean, I think also the process of working with Ian alerted us to comics that we didn't know. He had access to newspaper archives that we didn't have access to. And I think in some ways, Adele, I'm afraid to keep looking because then we're going to find other things, and then there's going to have to be a new comprehensive collection of 112. I think there probably are more out there. But we don't know them. We don't have access. Some of the papers may not be digitized, but I would imagine there are more Mr. Block works that we just don't know where he's submitting them to. Especially what happens for me, what happens in those years from 1914 to 1919. Like he was clearly brave enough to critique the war early on, but then he goes silent for a number of years, which given how much Riebe was producing seems suspicious. Like, and we know he comes up after the war. So what was he, as a creative, what was he doing in those times? What happened to that body of work? Does he have a personal archive somewhere out there that nobody knows about that has a lot more? Who knows?
And just while Sean's reading that, just to add on to that, it's reminding me of one of the talks we've given. I feel like someone mentioned it was somewhere in Europe, in Spain or something, like they feel like they saw one in another language. And then Patrick, your comments reminding me that they were international. And so it wouldn't surprise me to find out that there are copies floating around in other countries beyond just Canada and the US.
Yeah, just
Australia, New Zealand.
An Australia update. So
Okay.
Ian says, he seems to turn up in the Minneapolis phone book and had an address there for some time while he's publishing. He doesn't turn up in surviving online FBI records, investigating IWW members and German people in particular. There are death certificates that turn up for Ernest Riebe's, plural, but they are before he stopped publishing. So again, it is sort of a quagmire. We don't know a lot, as Patrick mentioned, about some of these folks who were clearly taking their skill and offering it to the movement. They weren't necessarily famous or getting rich from the work that they were doing, but that doesn't mean that the work is not important and worthy of understanding and recognition today. Thanks, John.
John, how are we for time? I feel like it was 8 o'clock. Do we have time for one more question?
Well, certainly another question.
Okay.
Sure, maybe another question or
More
two.
questions?
Anyone's got them.
Patrick or Candida, any final thoughts? I will ask you a question, Patrick, as an educator in like the K-12 system, but also, as a longtime labor organizer and labor educator, because you do all those great tours. I guess if you could, like you said, you teach with with Chester Brown's Blue Real comic, you read these things, I know you've done a reading group as well. If you had any kind of comments about just like what makes comics and these kind of so helpful for education and organization in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, the same thing that made them useful historically, or like at the time when they were released, is just that they're punchy, they're quick, right? Like Sean said, you can get a whole pamphlet or essay or soapbox speech in like a very short amount of time. And so I find that they're like an easy way for people to dive in, right? So even with just like a recent book club that we did within our union, trying to get someone to read a 300-page book versus trying to get them to read 100 pages of comics. I mean, it's really very easy, right? So I just think the accessibility of it, right? So it's not, you don't have to be a quote unquote intellectual, you don't have to be an academic, right, to enjoy comics. I think it's just much more accessible. There's not the same type of barrier there. And yeah, when I use comics, I don't use them a lot, but when I do use them in my class, like I think students connect with them, right? Because again, many students are not as familiar, not as commonly sitting down and reading long form novels, or particularly nonfiction, right? So for fiction, they sometimes will be like this, I really love that, but like not as much with nonfiction. So yeah, so political argument, analysis, understanding the world and how it works, but in again like a punchy format that is funny. It's not a lot of it. I mean, I guess the thing I didn't say in my short talk was also like there are memes today, right? Like there are forms of this today that exist. So it's not like it's gone completely, but in like a working class press or like format that like exists, it's not the same, right? But yeah, those things are still out there in different formats.
And perhaps as someone who teaches comics, Canada, in terms of something like Mr. Block and these early comics, like how do you teach with them? How do you think students will respond or could respond to kind of understanding this kind of work?
I think when teaching historical comics, it's really important to help students overcome their feeling of historical distance, but also to not collapse that distance. So I would want to contextualize the comic, as I kind of started to in a scattered way today, and talk about other art forms because, I mentioned vaudeville. I see a lot of vaudeville in Mr. Block. I see early cinema. I see, lots of other kind of art forms going in there. So, and I would want to teach it in terms of the print culture too. Where was the comic published? What else was on the page? How much did it cost? Who had access to it? So the kind of material culture of it too. So I think it's important to think about comics as texts, as we do in English classes, things to read and study, but also as objects in the world that were produced and distributed and consumed and sometimes thrown away or destroyed because they weren't meant to be in archives. They were meant to just be ephemeral. So I try to teach comics as part of culture and everyday life and not necessarily as, enduring works of whatever, high literature. Students love historical comics in my experience and will often want to make ones that update them. And in terms of using comics for teaching, I've started doing more sort of alternative assignments for comics making in my classes, and my students know the software and programs much better than I do. And I've read some fantastic short comics by students who see it as a way to communicate quickly and powerfully. So I think web comics is where I would go to find the equivalent of Mr. Block today, where people can self-publish, people who don't have access to mainstream publishing or printing. Comics are expensive to print because they're often, there's color production costs and expensive paper and so on. So I would go and look at online comics, and that's certainly where I would see more radical and subversive work happening. And if they're lucky, those people get picked up by either a larger website that will nest them, RIP The Nib, which is an amazing comics website for long-form non-fiction comics, but also publishers who do print books. But I think online is the way to go for younger cartoonists, emerging cartoonists, and more radical cartoonists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, part of, I think, our goal of creating this was not only, to celebrate Ernest Riebe's work, but also to revive interest in Mr. Block as a character. He's not, I think Patrick mentioned, this idea of IWW culture as being one of borrowing and building on. And I think in many ways, Mr. Block hasn't changed much in 100 years. he'd be in favor of sending billionaires to the moon. Well, he can't.
You might
pay his
get to
rent.
go one day, Sean. If he works hard and saves his pennies.
If he saves his pennies, he might get there, but.
We get left behind.
Exactly.
Bezos is going to leave him. But thanks for contributing to my intergalactic journeys. I think that blockism is still very much with us. And our hope was that in creating this book, we could help people understand how things have changed a lot, but not so much. And that the tools of the early 20th century are still relevant. And lampooning the blockheads among us is still a very useful tactic in trying to figure out how we can make a better world together. And we really want to thank Candida and Patrick for coming out to help us celebrate and launch the book here in our home in Winnipeg. And thanks to all of you for coming out and spending your evening with us. Thank you very much. Thanks to John for his amazing technical abilities and allowing us to have a virtual space that we can share with you.
I'll just rudely steal your microphone.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you so very much. That was a completely fascinating conversation. I'm sure we could have gone on for another half hour because this work is such an incredibly rich book. So what we will do now is we will be moving along Sean and Julia to a table just beside the couch desk where you should feel free to join us. There are copies of both Mr. Block as well as other books by the Graphic History Collective there. So if you would like any signed, please feel free to get them signed. You can pay for the books first, you can pay for the books afterward, but as we are shameless capitalists here at the store, we do ask that you just pay for them before you leave. We're so very grateful to everybody on the panel for contributing all their knowledge and incredible work. So again, Candida Rifkind, Patrick McGuire, Julia Smith, Sean Carleton, and of course, Ian McIntyre in absentia. So thank you all so very much. If you are unfamiliar with the work of the Graphic History Collective, it really is a fascinating project. So I'd encourage you to check out their publications on their website. I'd also like to thank Between the Lines Books for making this evening and this publication possible, as well as their partners, PM Press. So thank you all so very much for joining us here tonight. Please do have a very lovely evening.